Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all enjoying the President's holiday. It's an inside joke on a few of us. It is great to welcome many colleagues, friends, students, neighbors, some members of our Board of Trustees, today's Friends of Leslie lecture. At our previous lectures, we've interacted with speakers around a broad range of topics, such as neuroscience and student learning, charter schools and public schools. We actually had a session with the commissioners of the Massachusetts Department of Education from early childhood to higher education, looking at their policy priorities. And today we focus actually on ourselves, on higher ed, and the economics of higher education. Higher ed is increasingly in the news, occasionally for the wrong reasons, specifically related to economics, the seemingly inexorable rise in tuition and fees, mounting concerns about student debt load, probing questions from state and federal governments about the value of taxpayer investment in higher ed. And those are what I might call the common denominator concerns, topics that are covered in the popular media, often treating all of higher ed as if it's one unified economic sector, sharing those and many other characteristics. However, those of us in higher ed know that the various higher ed sectors have very distinctive characteristics. So if you think about the finances of a large urban public community college with, let's say, 20,000 students, it's quite different than the finances of a rural, small, religious undergraduate college with 900 students. And the financial context of a regional public university enrolling, let's say, 3,000 or 4,000 students is quite different than the flagship land-grant public university with maybe 25,000 students. And the students and families in the communities that are served by America's diverse higher education institutions, they are also changing. The income gap is affecting not just where a student goes to college, but increasingly whether a student can go to college. And the fastest growing portion of our population is less prepared for and less able to pay for college. So we're really interested in two questions. First, what are the pressures being felt in the sector of American higher education to which Leslie University belongs? The moderately selective, private, nonprofit, tuition-dependent, mission-driven institution. And second, what are the economic changes taking place in this country, especially with regard to family income and employment, that are weakening consumer demand for moderately selective, nonprofit, private colleges? And how does a university respond to these changes? Well, this coming year, Leslie is lowering its undergraduate tuition rates, accompanied by a proportionate reduction in institutional aid. We've become convinced that the high tuition price is so unimaginable for many, many more prospective students that they don't even inquire about institutional aid that can lower that high sticker price. They don't stick around long enough to find out about it. This is one response to the changing and deteriorating economic conditions of American working class and middle class families. We've developed an Urban Scholars Initiative in which we partner with urban nonprofits who work with city high school students to get them ready to enroll in and succeed in college. Urban students who apply for regular admission at Leslie and have the recommendation of their nonprofit program can enroll at Leslie and receive a 50% tuition scholarship from the university and benefit from a growing Urban Scholar Initiative endowed scholarship fund, which has been initiated by a Leslie alum who gave us initially $500,000 to start the fund, challenged us to raise another $500,000, which we've done, and she and her husband will contribute another $500,000 so that that foundation will begin with a $1.5 million base to it. And with the leadership of our Provost Williams, Leslie is developing new programmatic partnerships with community colleges, especially urban community colleges. These partnerships include articulation agreements that facilitate the transfer of community college students to Leslie, complementary academic advising for these students to support effective transfer, and now the offering, soon to come, of Leslie bachelor degree programs on the community college campus. So we try to create, design, implement new programs, new partnerships, new delivery systems to serve diverse student populations, to extend educational access to underserved populations, and to try to connect educational opportunity with economic opportunity for our students and their families. And we do this in an increasingly pervasive regulatory environment, both state and federal. Well, given the relevance of these challenges that we work with, it's our good fortune to have someone highly regarded for his expertise in higher ed with us today to shed some light on these issues. And while many of us within our own institutions can claim to have a thorough understanding of dynamics affecting our college or university, it is very useful to bring in an expert from a different geographic location, a different kind of institution, to share his perspective and to stimulate our thinking about our place in the higher ed sector, in our relationships to the students, the families, and the communities that we serve. Dr. Don Heller is the Dean of the College of Education at Michigan State University, was previously director of the Center for the Study of Higher Ed at Penn State. His academic areas of focus have been educational economics, public policy and finance, and much of this is stimulated by his interest in college access and choice for low-income and minority students. So the plan is that Dr. Heller will take us through his presentation and his comments, and then we'll open it up, actually he'll open it up, for your questions, your comments, some interaction with him, and following that session, we'll welcome you to join Don and all of us for reception right up here in the Marin Gallery. I do not want, however, to conclude this brief welcome by leaving you with the impression that Dr. Heller is perfectly objective just because he's currently coming from Michigan. In fact, I encourage each of you to listen very carefully to any perceived bias in his comments about the region in general and Leslie in particular. There's just a few red flags in his bio that require some disclosures. First, he earned his bachelor's degree at Tufts, perilously close to Leslie, and earned his master's and doctoral degrees at another institution even closer to Leslie. Those are flags 1 and number 2. The third flag is even worse. His daughter Rosie is a sophomore here at Leslie in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. So those conflicts now disclosed, we thank Rosie for sharing her family with us today and welcome Don Heller, his wife Ann Simon, and Rosie's younger sister Lena to Leslie University. Don?
Thank you, Joe. That was very nice. And as Joe noted, I've been a long-time resident of this area. I lived outside Teal Square for many years, went to Tufts, went to another school down Mass Ave for a couple of degrees. So very familiar to this area. In fact, as we were driving around yesterday and today, my wife and I would note the places that are still open that were here decades ago when I was a college student, undergraduate student myself, that are still here and still open, and it's great to see that. So I really appreciate the invitation to be here. It's nice to be here, and as Joe said, I am a parent of a Leslie student, and I'm a proud parent of a Leslie student. And let me just, why don't you just... If you want to just stand up, Rosie, and just wave, stand up and wave to everybody. See, she wouldn't stand up, so I thought if you couldn't really see her in the back because she wouldn't turn around, this is what she looks like. Usually fathers have to wait till their daughters' weddings to embarrass them, but this is a rare opportunity for me to do that ahead of time. So this is when we lived in Teal Square, Somerville. This is what Rosie looked like, and here's what she looks like today. So, but it is great to be here. As Joe said, I'm going to take about 45 minutes to talk about some of the challenges facing higher education today. I'm going to go through a lot of this very quickly. I've got a lot of slides. I'm primarily a quantitative researcher having an economics background, so I'm going to go through things, lots of numbers fairly quickly. You will see that there are numbers on the slide, so when we get to the Q&A, if there's a particular slide you want to go back to, just note the number. I'll bring it back up. We can talk about it. And here's the agenda that I'm going to be talking about today. And also, I'll tell you, at the end of the presentation, I'm going to put up the website of my, the URL of my website back at Michigan State, where I'll put, when I get back to the office, I'll put a copy of these slides so you can, welcome to download them. I'm going to talk about, first of all, just very briefly, why does college matter? Why do we care as a nation whether students go to college or not? And then I'm going to talk about the first challenge, which is the increasing price, but also the costs of higher education. This is something that's very much in the news. You see it in the media. You see it among policymakers, and I'm going to talk about these differences between rising price and rising costs and what they mean for affordability of higher education in the country. The other major challenge is, as Joe mentioned, the demands for accountability. We're getting a lot of pressure in higher education, those of us in higher education, to demonstrate that we're adding value, not just to individuals who are going to our institutions, but adding value to society, because there's a huge public investment in higher education. So I'll be talking about where some of those demands come from and what form they're taking right now, today. I'm going to close at the end by just saying a little bit about where I think we're going to be going from here on these two issues. And then also, because I head a large college of education, we've got about 5,000 students, many of them involved in being training to be teachers and administrators. I am going to talk a little bit about teacher preparation and some of the demands on teacher preparation today. And then at the end, as I said, I hope to have a dialogue with you, so I'll look forward to your questions or your reactions to some of the things I have to say today, and please feel free to challenge me on any of these things. So the first question is, why does college matter? Why do we as a nation, and we've had this goal now for over 60 years, of encouraging people to go to college and get some form of post-secondary training after high school? Why is this important to us as a nation? And this is a report that comes out every couple of years from the College Board. It's a very good report that documents what both the individual as well as the public returns are to investing in higher education. And there are basically two categories. The first is economic outcomes, and not surprisingly, and I think a lot of you who are students, I know a lot of my students are going to college primarily because they know that they're going to earn more money after earning a college degree than if they had just entered the labor force with only a high school diploma. But it's not just earnings and what people earn. So certainly earnings are higher for college graduates, unemployment rates are lower, things like job satisfaction, health and retirement benefits are better, more social mobility. All of these kinds of economic factors are all stronger and more positive for people who go on to college. There are also, however, social outcomes. So we know from the data that people who go to college have lower rates of smoking, lower obesity rates, higher exercise levels, all these kinds of behaviors that we want to encourage people to engage in to be healthier and lead better lives. Now, we're very good in higher education about documenting these. There are many people doing research on them. What we're not as good talking about is that you have to be careful about conflating correlation with causality. So when somebody goes to college, whether it's at Michigan State or here or any other institution, and we can measure how much they earn when they graduate from college, and then we can compare that to people who only go to high school, earn a high school diploma, and then enter the labor markets. It's very simple to get the data and compare those two, and we can show that on average, people who go to college earn more money. The problem is that the people who go to college and earn those degrees are not the same as the people who only earn a high school diploma. They have a number of characteristics that are not only valued by colleges in enrolling them, but are also valued in labor markets. They generally have higher levels of academic achievement. They often have higher levels of drive. They often have higher levels of intellect in general. And all of those things are valued in labor markets as well. So that difference between what a college graduate earns and a high school graduate earns is not being driven just by the value added of college. And frankly, we're not very good in higher education about admitting that. But for those of us who do research on it, it's a very important caveat about these measurements between high school graduates and those who go on to college. All right, so let me turn now to college prices and costs and try to talk a little bit about these two different things. I've been researching this since I was a graduate student back in the early 90s, and all of this focus on the cost of higher education prices, really started around this era in the early to mid-90s. And this was a Newsweek magazine cover from 1996, just about when I was finishing graduate school. And if you can't read it, it says, "The scary cost of college, $1,000 a week." So at the time, The top private college prices, the most expensive private colleges in the country, were charging about $28,000 for what we call the cost of attendance. That's tuition, room, board, books, miscellaneous costs. So if you divide $28,000 by two 14-week semesters, you get $1,000 a week. Now today we would think of this as fairly affordable and quaint. But back then, this was a cover news in Newsweek magazine and many other magazines and newspapers at the time. So it really was this era in the early 90s, mid-90s, where we really started to see a lot more attention in the media, a lot more attention from policymakers to how expensive college was going. Had breakfast with some friends this morning and we were talking about this issue. And I noted that in my last year at Tufts, it was 1980-1981 school year, tuition, room, and board there for the first time exceeded $10,000, went into 5 digits. There were tuition protests on campus. Everybody was absolutely up in arms and said nobody is going to continually pay over $10,000 for a private college education. I don't need to tell most of you what Tufts charges today. I'm sure you can guess. But nevertheless, back 20 years or so ago, this was news. And this is really when we started to see a lot of attention focusing on this question. So what I want to do is start to give you some baseline data about what has happened with college prices going back now over the last 30 years, 32 years or so. And I'm going to show you different sectors so you can see how they compare. So first of all, this is the average price, and these are data again from the College Board, from a very good survey they do every year. This is the average tuition price and the increase in tuition price, I should say, at private 4-year colleges and universities. So this is all 4-year private colleges and universities around the country. It's weighted by enrollment. So this shows what's happened with prices. And you can see it's gone up about 200% in those 32 years or so. That's about a 3-time increase. And these, by the way, are all in constant dollars. So this takes inflation out of the picture, and it's just in constant dollars. So this is above inflation how much the price has gone up, about 3 times now in private universities. These are public 4-year universities like my own, Michigan State University. As you can see, it's gone up almost 4 times or 300% during the same time period. And then these are community colleges, which have tracked during a lot of this period very closely to the private institutions. During the 2000s, early 2000s, had more moderated increases, but again, as the recession has hit, have picked up and have had just about the same rate of growth, about 200%, as have private institutions. Now, when we talk about tuition prices and the ability of people to pay these and go to college, we do it in measures of affordability. How much can people afford to pay these prices? Because if prices are going up, it's not necessarily a problem by itself if, in fact, people can afford to pay those prices. So what I thought I would do is show you what's happened with income growth in the country by showing you the median family income over the same time period. And it's gone up about 12% in real terms, again, discounting for inflation. So you can see that the price of college in all 3 sectors, it doesn't matter if you're looking at a community college, private institution, a public institution, has gone up much, much faster than have the ability of at least the median family to pay for those college prices. And again, this is why we've seen so much focus on this, is because of the drop in affordability. No matter which sector you're looking at, college is becoming less and less affordable for every student, every family out there, unless you're in the absolute top of the income distribution. Now, we all know that it's not just the sticker price, and what I showed you before was the sticker price of college, because we've developed many different forms of financial aid and literally scores of billions of dollars of financial aid that are available to students. So what's really important is to understand the net price that students pay, which is the difference between the sticker price or the posted price that we put in our view books and on our website and what the student actually pays when they get their bill at the beginning of that first semester. So I'm going to show you the different forms of financial aid, again, going back over the last 30 years or so. And this is first the 4 primary sources of grant aid. So that black line there are federal grants. These are primarily Pell Grants from the Department of Education in Washington. The red line are institutional grants. These are the scholarships and grants that are awarded by colleges and universities around the country. The green line is private grants. These are things like Kiwanis Club scholarships. Sometimes it's tuition scholarships from employers for the children of their employees or for their employees themselves. And then the bottom line is state grants. So this would be a program here in Massachusetts or in Michigan that awards grants to individuals from state resources. And as you can see, there have been some fairly healthy increases during this time period. And again, these are in constant dollars, so I've taken out inflation. So for example, federal grants have gone up from about $20 billion to about $47 billion in the most recent year. The largest growth has been in the institutions themselves, and this is primarily in what we call tuition discounting. So if you go back to 1980, you would see very, very few institutional grants and scholarships in public institutions. Private institutions have long had scholarships going back to the colonial era, for example. There have been scholarships for students, from needy students. But public institutions had very few scholarships other than things like athletic scholarships and small numbers of what we call talent scholarships, musical or artistic talent. But what's happened over the last 30 years is that public institutions are starting to act much more like private institutions. And they too are discounting tuition so that a much higher proportion of their students are getting scholarships, just as in the private institutions. And if you look across the country now, roughly half of all students, even if you include community colleges, are getting some form of discount in the form of a grant from institutions themselves. About 25% of students get grants from the federal government, again, largely Pell Grants. So the biggest increase you can see has been among the institutional grants and this tuition discounting that's been going on. And I'll come back and talk a little bit about this later. Now, the other major form of financial aid that most people think of as financial aid is student loans. And today, well over half, about 2/3 of all students who are taking out some form of student loans, mostly federal student loans. My philosophy is that student loans are not a form of financial aid. Now, institutions, when they send out a financial aid offer to a student who's been offered admission, they will include in their grants, but also include in their federal loans, sometimes private loans, as a way of reducing the cost of paying for college. I don't think of it as financial aid because it doesn't reduce the cost of paying for college. What it does is postpone when you pay for college. And in fact, in most loan programs, there is some form of interest that you have to pay. So it actually does increase your cost of college, but it allows students to postpone, and many students have what economists call capital constraints, so they don't have the pocket money, they don't have cash in their pockets to pay for college, so loans help them postpone when they pay for college to after they've graduated, and then hopefully are getting all of those benefits that people earn in the labor markets from having a college degree. And as you can see, there's been a huge increase in the federal loans over the last 30 years. It went up from about $17, $18 billion now to over $100 billion a year the federal government is awarding in student loans to students across all three of these sectors: undergraduate, public four-year institutions, private community colleges, also graduate and undergraduate as well. The other major form of loans are private loans. This is when you walk into Citibank or Chase or TD Bank and ask for a loan to pay for college. These tend to be much more expensive because they're treated as uncollateralized loan. Federal loans are subsidized, so they have a lower rate. Most federal loans are subsidized. And private loans saw a huge run-up in the early 2000s until the recession hit, the most recent recession. And there were great constraints on capital, and many banks and other student loan lenders, private student loan lenders, got out of that business. So you can see after that peak in about 2008, the private loan business has all but dried up. And there is a little bit of good news, is that the volume of federal loans has been decreasing the last year or two, as well as there's been, again, more focus. I'm sure many of you have seen news reports starting about a year and a half ago now that talked about the fact that student loan debt exceeded a total of over $1 trillion, more than auto debt, credit card debt put together. So there's been a lot of focus on this issue of student loans and how much students are borrowing. And again, this is a topic I'm going to come back to. But the important thing to remember, and from my perspective, is that loans are not a form of discounting. They don't lower the cost of going to college. If you go to buy a car and take out a loan to buy that car, nobody thinks of that as a discount. It's simply allowing you to pay for it over time. And the same thing is true of student loans. They don't lower the cost of going to college or the price of going to college. They simply allow for you to pay for it later in your lives. So you take these two things together, the sticker prices that I showed you and financial aid, and what we really want to know is what's happened with net prices. So not the sticker price, but what has happened to the amount that people actually pay. So again, the College Board does a very nice report where they show, and they've looked over 4 time periods here, going back to 1996, 1997. They look at both the sticker price and then they look at the net price that students have paid. And the net price here is defined as that sticker price less all of the tuition discounts and grants and scholarships that students have been awarded, along with tax credits. So they include tax credits and taking that off the top. Because again, if you get a tax credit for going to college for the tuition you've paid, you get that fairly quickly in the next year. So they consider that a discount, no different in some ways than a grant or a scholarship. So I'm going to show you the 3 different, again, college sectors. First of all, community colleges. So the blue bars here are the sticker price. So if you go down to Roxbury Community College and you go in the door and you say, what do you charge for tuition? They'll tell you. And across the country, the most recent data from a couple of years ago, the sticker price, the average sticker price at a community college was about $3,000. Now, the net price, as you can see, has dropped from about $500 in 1996, 1997 to now what is a negative number. And the reason for that is that students are getting enough grant aid to cover not just all of their tuition, but actually some of their living expenses, room and board as well. So you can see if you go back to 1996, students had to pay a net tuition price of about $1,500 a year, plus all of their living expenses. Now they're actually getting all of their tuition covered through grant aid and actually having some of their living expenses covered. And again, these are in constant dollars, so in all of these measures, I'm taking out inflation. Well, in public four-year universities, you can see again, there's been almost a doubling in the sticker price from about $4,300 a year to about $8,200 a year. But there's also been an increase in the net price, but not nearly as fast. So students today, after you take away all of the tax credits and all of the scholarships and grants they earn in public four-year universities, are paying a net tuition of only $2,500 a year. Very different than the sticker price of $8,200 a year. Now again, this doesn't include room and board, and students have to pay to live. But you can see that the net price that people are paying is well less on average than these sticker prices, which is what you generally see in the stories in the newspapers and magazines. And then in four-year private universities, it's much higher. We know that. We know the private institutions charge a lot more. It's gone up. The sticker price has gone up from almost $19,000 to about $28,500. But look at the net price. The average student in a private four-year university in this country is paying a net tuition of only $13,000 a year. So very different from the almost $30,000 a year that's the sticker price. And if you look across the three sectors, in every one of them, the increase in the sticker price has been much faster than the increase in the net price. And I would say that we in higher education have done a lousy job of getting this message across. We haven't really communicated well to both policymakers and the public and the media that in fact net prices are not rising on average nearly as fast as sticker prices have been. And I think if we did a better job of doing that and explaining this in a way that people could understand, families, students, policymakers, the media could understand, we wouldn't have as much of the criticism we're getting about the run-up in the sticker prices. And in fact, if you look at many institutions, and you can get this data from the Department of Education, it's easily available on the web, you will see at many private institutions, in fact, a tiny proportion are paying that sticker price. Often as few as 5, 8, 10, 12% of students are paying the sticker price. Every other student is getting some form of tuition discount. And again, I don't think we've done a good job of communicating this, and we could do a much better job of explaining this to parents and students and policymakers and the media. The problem and the challenge is that during this time period from 1996 to 2011, median incomes only grew 1%. So yes, even though sticker prices have gone up much faster than have net prices, we know that there simply aren't the resources available, at least for that average family at the median, to pay those increased prices. So while I've said that we haven't done a good job getting our message across about this, I don't want to discount the fact that, in fact, college is much less affordable today in every one of those sectors than it was 15 or so years ago. So, you know, I've been talking mostly about averages across the country, but what I wanted to do is give you a picture of how it might be for students from different families. So these are the rates at which students who graduate from high school and then go on and enroll in college within 12 months of graduating from high school. So this is a very common measure that the Department of Education in Washington uses to track college enrollments over time. They use this 12-month window to allow students to perhaps take a gap year. Sometimes students don't enroll right in September after graduating from high school. They sometimes postpone for a semester or 2 semesters. So we give them 12 months to enroll in college, and that's when we start to measure these enrollment rates. So these are the enrollment rates by family income quintile, or each fifth of the family income distribution, over the last almost 25 years or so. And there's some good news and some bad news here. And what I've shown you is over to the right, the most recent data from 2011, what the categories are of those income categories. So for example, the top income quintile, or the top 1/5 of all families in the nation, those are students coming from families with incomes above about $90,000, roughly $90,000 a year. Conversely, the bottom group, the dashed black line, that's the group of families, the bottom fifth of families, those with incomes below about $18,000 a year. So you can see how these have changed over time. And there's some good news here. And the good news is that every one of these groups has increased the rate of college going over time. And that's a very positive thing for the country. As I said, we've had, going back to post-World War II era, a national goal articulated in many different ways to increase the number of students who go on to college. So we certainly have made progress in the last 25 years, even during this period of the run-up of tuition prices. The bad news out of this picture is that we still have large gaps between rich and poor. In those same documents, things like the Truman Commission report in 1947, the Higher Education Act in 1965, Spelling's Commission report 2006, every one of these has had not just the goal of increasing college attainment in the country, but also closing the gap between rich and poor. And the language that's been used in general is something along the lines of, we don't want finances to be a barrier to any student who could otherwise benefit from attending college. But in fact, finances are still a barrier. Now, we know that students go to college for lots of reasons. Some of it is because of financial issues, some of it because of social and cultural issues. And there's also an important correlation here. And the other important correlation is that students from poorer families, on average, have much worse academic preparation for college. So not only do they face higher financial barriers, not only do they get worse preparation in high school, they also generally come from first-generation families, so their parents, their siblings often haven't been to college. They haven't grown up in a culture of college going and college aspiration like many middle-class and most upper-class students have. So the barriers faced by these students in the bottom half of the income distribution are not just the tuition prices or the lack of enough financial aid. It's also the cultural barriers, it's also the academic preparation. And very often these students only have as an option a community college because of price barriers or because that's all they can get admitted to. And I don't want to denigrate community colleges, but if somebody has an aspiration of getting a bachelor's degree, the data are very clear. All other things being equal, even if you control for how academically prepared somebody is, all other things being equal, somebody is much more likely to get a bachelor's degree if they start at a four-year institution. Yes, some students are successful at starting a community college, and for many students, it's an excellent option. You pay lower tuition for 2 years and then transfer to a four-year institution to earn your baccalaureate degree. But on average, a student who starts at a community college is much less likely to earn a bachelor's degree. So if we have a system that only has community college as an option for some students, it means we're going to be forcing those students out of the option of getting a bachelor's degree, or for many of those students out of that option. So you can see there's still large gaps between rich and poor. So we haven't closed those gaps even though we've had this national objective of closing the gaps and ensuring equity in college access and college attainment. So we still have a lot of work to do, as you can see from the data there. Okay, so let me turn now to why is it that college costs and also college prices have gone up so rapidly during this era? Because if you go back to the 50s and 60s, for example, college prices did not rise that quickly. So this isn't something that's been going on forever. It's really been a phenomenon the last 35 or 40 years or so. So with some apologies to David Letterman, I'm going to give you the top 10 reasons why college costs and prices have been going up so quickly. So first of all, number 10, we are a very labor-intensive industry who's been unwilling to substitute capital for labor. Okay? We have highly skilled, highly educated people working in many of our positions in colleges and universities. If you think about things like banking today compared to 40 years ago, and think about how they have embraced technology in order to bring their costs down, or other sectors of the economy who've done the same thing, we have not done that in higher education. We have not been able to subsidize capital by bringing in technology to control cost nearly as much as have most other sectors of the economy. So as those other sectors of the economy are becoming more productive, we are going to be in comparison less productive. And that means our costs are going to be going up compared to other sectors of the economy. And if you look at the government's data on inflation through the Consumer Price Index, the cost of higher education has exceeded every other item in the Consumer Price Index, even healthcare, even energy costs. And this is one of the key reasons, is because we haven't found ways to make ourselves more productive. Now, I'm standing here with some technology, a computer and a projector and a screen and a clicker. But for the most part, we still teach today the way we did when Harvard was founded in 1636. One person standing on front of on a stage in front of a bunch of students. And for the most part, in the core portion of our undergraduate curricula, we have not found ways to make ourselves more productive, again, at least in comparison to most other parts of the economy. Okay, so number 9, as I said, we have highly skilled, well-compensated labor. Now, that's not across every position in colleges and universities, but if you look at the average payrolls of colleges and universities, they are much more skewed towards higher-end labor than are most other industries in this country. So that's going to also push up our costs relative to other sectors. We also have generally very good and expensive benefits packages compared to most other sectors, and that's also going to add to the cost increases. We have expensive and expansive physical plants. I can only imagine what the value of the real estate is that Lesley University is occupying here in the prime parts of Harvard Square and Porter Square, Cambridge. And Lesley University cannot easily decide to move to Mississippi because real estate and labor costs are cheaper. You can't outsource higher education, or at least higher education as we think of it, or move it to a lower cost part of the country like we did with the textile industry in New England, like a lot of the automobile industry has moved out of Michigan and into lower cost non-union parts of the country. You can't easily pick up most colleges and universities and move them the way that we have with manufacturing plants. We have competition that's driven by perceptions of quality, not price, with poor consumer information. Okay? So when people are shopping for college, yes, people do look at price, but when they're looking within a price band, they are not looking to differentiate prices. They're really looking at the amenities that they're going to get. And this, again, we're talking primarily about traditional college students now, those coming out of high school, going to college full-time, the residential experience. But we in higher education have been very good about adding amenities to the cost in order to try to meet these issues of quality that people are looking for. And that's what's driven the competition, has been primarily around quality, not among driving down prices, again, unlike other parts of the economy. We've also been unwilling to compromise on quality. Okay, so if we have a freshman seminar with 20 students in it, we could pretty quickly double the productivity by having 40 students in that freshman seminar. Most colleges are not willing to do that. Maybe at the margins they'll add a few more students, but for the most part we haven't been willing to take 20-person seminars and turn them into 100-person lectures. Now we have done some things to try to address this issue. There's been a huge growth of adjunct and non-tenure track faculty in higher education in the last 30 years. Some would argue that that has impacted quality. I think the evidence is out on that, at least if you're talking about teaching. So that's certainly been one way where we've tried to address this issue, and we have tried to control costs while hopefully not harming quality. Number 4, we've been broadening participation to new populations. Back in the 1970s, only about 50% of high school grads went on and enrolled in college. Now we're up to about 68, 70%. Those additional 18 or 20% of students coming out of high school now going into college, where are they coming from in the academic distribution? So if you think of the academic distribution of a high school class, with the lowest down here and the top up here, well, back about 40 years ago, it was the top half that was going on to college. And now we're dipping further and further down into that academic distribution. So students who need more support coming to college, maybe they have learning disabilities and we need to, under federal law, accommodate those disabilities so they can be successful. 40 years ago, people like that would not have gone to college. Now they are, and we have to provide the support to help make them successful. That's also helped drive up costs. Number 3, state and federal regulation. Again, this is somewhat controversial. I think people in higher education like to point to this as a reason. It is true that there are more regulations today imposed upon colleges and universities, like other employers, for example, than we had 40 or 50 years ago. I don't think there have been many really good studies that have tried to capture what the real cost of that regulation has been, but many in higher education will point to this as one of the drivers of costs. Number 2, and this is for those of us in the public sector, is declining state appropriations, particularly in the last decade or so. In Michigan, for example, we have seen our appropriation from the state on a per-student basis decline by 30% in 12 years. Now, what happens when we get less money from the state? Very good, Rose, thank you. That was my daughter who's been listening to the dinner table conversation at home. When at Michigan State University we get less money from the state, we turn around and we raise tuition faster. We have to get it from students as well as their parents. We do try to do things like raise money, and particularly for scholarships. So as we raise tuition, we try to raise financial aid as well. And I think my university's had a very good track record of doing that. But across the country, as states invest less in public institutions, both community colleges and four-year, the institutions raise tuition prices to make up for it. So in the public sector, that's been a critical driver of increased prices, has been this decline in state appropriations. But out of all of these things, the number one reason that prices now, and let me talk about prices, not just costs, have gone up over the last 40 years or so, is because of strong demand for higher education. How many of you have taken at some point in your college careers or high school careers a microeconomics course? Okay, a lot of you. So in the absence of strong demand for a good, what happens if you increase prices? Price goes up, what do people do? They buy less of the good, right? So if Hershey's increased the price of their Hershey's bars or Hershey's Kisses and started to raise the price very rapidly, and if people decided it wasn't worth it, they would buy fewer Hershey's bars. They'd go and buy a Mars bar or something else instead. Well, the only reason that we've been able to increase our prices in response to all of these increases in costs is because we've had this cover of the increased demand for higher education. The message about higher education being critical to earning a good living has gotten out there. Students, adult learners, they've gotten that message. And it's not just a message. The reality is, in today's economy, without some form of post-secondary training, the odds that you're going to be able to earn what we used to call a middle-class wage, have a middle-class lifestyle, are very, very slim. You have to have some form of post-secondary training. It doesn't mean necessarily a bachelor's degree. There's some good vocational programs that people can earn good livings, a middle-class lifestyle with. But you've got to have some form of post-secondary training. And as more people have gone to college, that's increased the demand, and that's given us the cover to raise prices. Absent that increase in demand, there's no way we would have been able to increase prices, even the net prices I've shown you over the last 40 years of the rates that we have. Okay. So let me turn now to the second challenge I said I would talk about, and that's accountability. And as I said, going back to the early 90s, we've had this focus on what's been going on with tuition prices. And as I like to call it, why is everyone hating on us so much, as some of the college students calling it today? Why is everybody picking on us? We have been often called the best higher education system in the world, and I think that's still a label that fits for higher education in the United States. But why is it everybody is picking on us so much? Well, first of all, as I said, is prices. Prices have been going up much faster than any other parts of our economy, and people notice that. And we haven't gotten the message out there about the difference in sticker prices versus net prices. But as I said, even net prices have been going up much faster than the ability of students and parents to pay for it. You can't pick up a newspaper these days without seeing something about some college president and what they're making, or even more so, athletic coaches, and even faculty members. Now, some of you may know that Michigan State University this year won the Rose Bowl, and we were very proud of that. But in between, when Michigan State qualified for the Rose Bowl by winning the Big Ten, winning the Big Ten championship, and before they even won the Rose Bowl, our Board of Trustees gave a $2 million raise to our football coach, from about $2.2 million to about $4.2 million. Hadn't even won the Rose Bowl yet. He won the Big Ten championship. And his assistant coaches all got raises too. Now, when you see things like that, and you think about us as a public institution, or a private not-for-profit institution as well, it's hard for people not to wonder about million-dollar salaries and whether that's appropriate. There's been a lot of criticism about administrative bloat. There are more administrators today. The ratio of administrators to faculty has gone up, and that's absolutely true. The objective data are very clear. There are more administrators today. But I believe there are good reasons why we have more administrators. Part of it, as I said before, is we're serving very different populations of students. And, for example, the Resource Center for Students with Learning Disabilities that we have to have today, because under federal law we have to meet the needs of students with learning disabilities in our colleges, didn't exist in many campuses 3 or 4 decades ago because we simply wouldn't admit students who had learning disabilities. And there have been a lot of questions about the outcomes of higher education. Nationally, we don't have a great track record on graduation rates. We have one of the highest college access rates in the world. As I said, about 70% of all kids graduating from high school now are going on to some form of post-secondary education. But only about half, even those who start in a bachelor's degree institution, in a four-year institution, only about half are earning a bachelor's degree within 6 years. So there's been a lot of focus on graduation rates. Learning outcomes. There was a book came out about 3 or 4 years ago called Academically Adrift that questioned whether students, even those earning bachelor's degrees, were really learning anything in college or learning very much in college. There have been surveys that have shown that some college graduates are coming out of college functionally illiterate. Those kinds of things don't help make our case in higher education. During the recession, there's been a lot of focus on college graduates who can't get jobs. It's true. Unemployment rates are up. Unemployment rates for college graduates in the current recession are up, but we've seen exactly the same pattern every recession going back for the last 60 years. Unemployment rates always rise, and they rise for every segment of the economy, whether it's people with only high school diploma or people with college degrees. If you think that unemployment among those recent college graduates is bad during this recession, look at the unemployment rate of people who have only a high school diploma, who are 18 or 19 or 22 or 23 years old. Their rates are more than twice the unemployment rates of those who have college degrees. And then, as I said before, student loan debt. There's a great series, great I say not in terms of its accuracy, but great in terms of its placement on the front page of the New York Times 2 years ago that talked and featured students who had borrowed $100,000 a year for a bachelor's degree. And it put this example out there of how terrible this is. Well, the actual data show that fewer than 1% of all students earning bachelor's degrees borrow $100,000 a year. In fact, the average now is about $24,000, $25,000 a year for all students completing bachelor's degree. To pay that back, if it's in federal loans, about $250 a month. A very reasonable amount of student loan debt for the return those people earn on their degree. But again, I don't think we've done a very good job in higher education of getting the actual data out there in comparison to what the media are talking about and what they're talking about in Congress. We've been criticized for a lack of innovation. We haven't adapted technology as much as perhaps we should or as other parts of the economy have. And the government is making a huge investment. As I showed you before, the government is investing scores of billions of dollars a year in financial aid and student loans, and they're now questioning, the federal government is questioning its investment along with state governments who are investing appropriations in public institutions. So back in 2006, 8 years ago now, at the time, the Secretary of Education, Margaret Spellings, under President Bush, put together a blue ribbon panel, commonly known as the Spellings Commission, issued this report called A Test of Leadership, Charting the Future of U.S. Higher Education. Here are some direct quotes from that report that focus on the issue of accountability. We must change from a system primarily based on reputation to one based on performance. A consumer-friendly information database. 8 years later, we still don't have that. Measure and report meaningful student learning outcomes. We still don't do that uniformly. An accreditation agency should make performance outcomes, including completion rates and student learning, the core of their assessment as a priority over inputs. And as I said before, we still don't have these kinds of outcome measures that are easily communicated to students and parents for them to make informed decisions about which institution they should attend. So fast forward now to the current administration, President Obama. And last August, President Obama made a very important speech to those of us in higher education that was focused on what he was going to do with respect to accountability. Now, in his first term, the president had put in place a number of relatively small measures around accountability, but this was the first time last August when he put these together in one major package with a number of new initiatives to try to hold higher education institutions accountable. Let me summarize these for you. There were 3 pieces of it. The first was called Pay for Performance, and this was to tie eligibility for federal aid both at the student level, whether a student would be eligible for Pell Grants or student loans, as well as institutional eligibility to some form of outcomes measurement. The next was to promote innovation and competition, and here are specific quotes again from the president's proposals. And again, it's focused again on information, better information, though he did say to strip away unnecessary regulations in recognition that there are some concerns about regulatory costs in higher education. And the third part was to ensure that student debt remains affordable. And again, with all of the focus on student debt, he had to do something around this. And the primary issue here was to promote more the income-based repayment plan that he put in place in his first administration, which ties student loan payments to what students or what former students are earning when they're out in the labor force. So the kinds of outcome measures that he talked about, and again, these are direct quotes, were how are institutions doing with respect to access, particularly are they enrolling low-income students as measured by Pell Grant recipients? How are they doing with affordability? What's the rate of increase at a particular institution in the sticker price? How much are they increasing scholarships, and what's the student loan debt of their graduates? And then outcomes such as graduation and transfer rates, the earnings of their graduates, and I've highlighted this because I'm going to come back to this in the next slide, and also how many of their graduates are earning advanced degrees. So again, the focus here is to get away from the traditional measures we've used in higher education, which are things that are used in the US News and World Report rankings that are focused on inputs. Things like, what are the average SAT scores of students going to an institution? How many valedictorians do they enroll? How many Nobel laureates are on their faculty? These are all input measures and don't tell us anything about what happens to that student when they walk out the door at the end of the day. So what the president wants to do is to focus more on those outcomes. And these are the examples that he gave of outcomes. And let me turn now and talk about some of the challenges that we know we'll be facing if, in fact, the federal government is going to put some of these accountability systems in place. And it's still unclear how much of this will go into place, because some of what the president has proposed will require congressional approval. And there's been somewhat of a lukewarm response, at least in the House of Representatives, not at least in part related to the difference in the control between the House and the White House. So some of the challenges that we know we're going to face is, first of all, we've learned a lot from No Child Left Behind. And one of the things we've learned from No Child Left Behind is that if you test people on certain things, you're going to get a lot of teaching to the test, and you're going to get a lot of focus on those subjects. So there have been those who propose that every person graduating from college should be forced to take some kind of standardized test, maybe something like the GRE. And some have proposed that we do that as a way of measuring whether people are really learning anything in 4 years of college. But if we do that, we're going to end up with some of the same traps we've run into in K-12 education, which is that we're going to end up with more teaching to the test. The unintended consequences, encouraging some behaviors at the detriment of others. Let me use one of my favorite examples. If we use earnings as an outcome measure, how much do the graduates of your institution earn when they're out there in the labor force? So let me take somebody graduating from my undergraduate teacher ed program. And they can go and they can work in a suburb of Detroit, fairly wealthy suburb. It would be something like the western suburbs of Massachusetts here, outside 128. And they might earn as a first-year teacher about $47,000, $48,000 a year. Now, those districts don't need more of my teachers. They can hire anybody they want because they pay so well, good working conditions, they have good benefits. If that same student of mine went to work in Detroit Public Schools, one of the poorest school districts in the state, where they struggle to get well-qualified teachers, they can't hire STEM teachers, they can't hire learning disabilities teachers. If that same graduate of mine went to Detroit Public Schools, he or she would probably earn about $40,000 a year. I would argue that person going to Detroit is a much better outcome for the state of Michigan and for my college than is that person going to work in Bloomfield Hills or Farmington Hills. But yet, if I'm going to be measured on the earnings of my graduates, I have an incentive to place my student in that wealthy suburb, not in Detroit or Lansing or Grand Rapids or Chicago. So that's just one example of the unintended consequences of a system like that. It's very hard to come up with an accountability system that recognizes the diversity of institutional missions, as President Moore was talking about. So we've got community colleges, we have small private religious affiliated universities, we have larger private urban universities like Lesley or DePaul University, where I'm a trustee, and then we have large public universities like Michigan State and small public universities like Mass College of Liberal Arts out in the Berkshires. How do we come up with one accountability system that would work for all of those different types of institutions? And then we have the competing priorities that we face in higher education. We have accreditation standards, both national accreditation as well as discipline-based accreditation. We have state regulation, and we have federal regulation. And we have to comply with all of those. And how do we do that, again, with one accountability system? So let me return now to this issue of earnings and some of the problems. And this is really at the forefront of what the president wants to do, and many others have proposed this as well. There are real limitations on the data we have to measure earnings. There's a problem of when to measure it. Do you measure it when somebody is 1 year out of college, 5 years, 10 years out, If you measure it when they're 10 years out, we know that their earnings are a factor of much more than just their college education. It's also a factor of what jobs they've taken, where they're working, and also their performance on the job. Did they go to graduate school or earn a graduate degree? Their perverse incentives, as I talked about before. Are we going to end up incentivizing people into things that are not socially responsible and are going to benefit the country? And most importantly, there's great variation within versus across institutions. And let me give you one example of this to show you this issue of trying to come up with measures of institutional performance based on earnings. So what I'm going to show you are data from a website called collegemeasures.org that's taken data from the unemployment insurance system in the state of Virginia to try to measure what the average earnings are for all the four-year both public and private institutions in Virginia. So they got access to the unemployment insurance data, and this is data that shows what people actually earn, because employers have to send records to the state unemployment insurance bureau every week or every month, along with the 6 or 7% that they have to pay into that pool. So what I'm going to show you are a couple of examples. First of all, George Mason University and the University of Virginia. These are two public institutions in the state of Virginia. First, for George Mason, the blue is the lowest major in the average earnings for the lowest major at George Mason. The red is the highest paying major at George Mason, and then the green is the average. So the average graduate from George Mason University earned $41,000 a year. Excuse me. These are the same data from the University of Virginia. Now, interestingly enough, the average graduate of the University of Virginia, and these are first-year earnings. This is their earnings 12 months after graduating. So the average person graduating from UVA actually earned less than George Mason. But if you compare these two institutions on most of the measures that we think of that measure college quality, every single one of those measures, University of Virginia looks like a better institution. Whether you look at graduation rates, admission rates, yield rates, retention, SAT, ACT scores, Virginia is a better institution than George Mason, and yet people coming out of University of Virginia earn less on average than George Mason. Now, let me show you another comparison again across institutions. The same data from College Measures. So these are all of the private and public four-year universities that had enough data for this website to actually measure the average earnings from low to high. And I blocked off the institution names because I don't want you to worry about that. I want you to look at the distribution. Okay? So for those of you who have some statistics background, the average is about $34,500, and the standard deviation, or a measure of this distribution, about $4,900. Okay? So these are the four-year public and private universities in Virginia. Now this is within the University of Virginia, the different averages for the different majors. Okay? So it goes from a low of $27,000 in first-year earnings up to a high of $60,000 in first-year earnings. The average is about 5,000 more than all public universities, but look at the difference in the standard deviation. There's a much higher spread, much more variation within the University of Virginia than there is across all the universities in Virginia. And here are the names and the majors if you're interested, and I'm sure you all are. So again, the University of Virginia is not the highest average. George Mason, University of Richmond, a private institution, have higher averages. Here in the University of Virginia, you can see biology majors. Nice STEM major, right? Lowest earnings of any of the majors in the University of Virginia. Highest earnings, computer and info sciences, systems engineering. If you're looking for education, it's not there because the University of Virginia does not have an undergraduate education program. They only have a 5-year combined bachelor's master's. So these are only people who earn bachelor's degrees. So again, the important message here, if you want to have an average for an institution as a measure of how well they perform, it's not really the variation across institutions. There's much more variation within institutions. So the message here to students and parents is it doesn't matter where you go. It's what you major in when you go there. That's the message we want to be getting out. So using earnings to try to pit one institution after another is really misleading information. Because knowing that the average at the University of Virginia is almost $40,000 doesn't really tell you anything because it all depends upon what you end up majoring in. That's why this fallacy of using average earnings is going to do nothing to help people make informed decisions about where to go to college. All right, so now that I beat up on President Obama a little bit, let me just talk for a couple minutes about where we go from here. Well, first of all, I think we need more tuition innovation, and I think what Lesley is doing with its new model of lowering the sticker price with a concurrent decrease in financial aid, I think it's a great experiment to see how this will work. Lesley is not the first institution that's done this. There have been a handful of these over the years, in the last 10 or 12 years. There are a few other institutions that have announced similar kinds of models this year, and I will tell you that people are watching this. I was at a conference last month of people working in admissions and financial aid, and there was a lot of discussion about Lesley and the other institutions that have announced these for the fall. So people are going to be watching this. And these kinds of experiments will tell us whether, in fact, lowering the sticker price will make college more accessible for people. Whether, in fact, that sticker price is more of a barrier than the net price is. I think we need to do more to expand income-based repayment of loans. Right now, fewer than 10% of all students are in income-based repayment. Most are in traditional payment repayment where you have a fixed amount you pay every month. We need to get more students into income-based repayment of loans. We need better pre-college counseling and pipeline programs so that students can make these informed decisions. It's not really deciding between the University of Richmond and the University of Virginia. It's thinking about what you want to major in, and then once you're in college, keeping students on track for that. If somebody wants to major in biology and earn on average $27,000 a year, I think we ought to let them. But they need to be informed about that choice early on, not when they get that first job. We need to focus grant aid on financially needy students. Too much of financial aid is going to students from the upper half of the income distribution. There are literally tens of billions of dollars a year in financial aid going to students from families making well into the top quarter of the income distribution. And we need to be more proactive. We in higher education need to be more proactive on measuring outcomes and coming up with good outcome measures on things like student learning. So we can demonstrate that when somebody earns a bachelor's degree from our institution, they have learned something. It's not just a teacher. Or coming up with new ways of compensating teachers is much easier as a solution than it is to address the problems of poverty that affect the students in schools that we know is the real driver of most differences in student performance in schools. And there have also been new techniques in data analysis, primarily value-added measures. This is really a relatively new field. And this is the issue of how much do student test scores increase over the course of a year, and how much of that can be attributed to the teachers and teacher performance. And as we've developed these techniques and more testing, it's made more and more data available to be able to use this as a hammer against teachers and teacher performance. So to counter some of this, I think we're going to have to come up with rigorous merit-based evaluation systems of educators, and not just evaluation, but pay as well. I know that merit pay is very controversial, particularly among teachers' unions. But I think the reality is that we're going to have to come up with good ways of measuring educator performance while controlling for the kinds of students they had that go beyond just value-added measures based on student test scores. Educator preparation institutions are going to have to be measured on our graduates' outcomes. In Michigan, we are right now looking at legislation that's going to force my School of Education to be evaluated based at least 50% on the test scores of the students in the classrooms of the teachers I produce. Even if that teacher hasn't been in my college in 20 years, I will still be judged based on the test scores of that teacher's students. And I think the reality is, and I probably would be dangerous saying this if I went to AACTE, the American Association of Colleges of Teacher Education conference in a couple of weeks and said this, but I think the reality is until we have some sacrificial lambs among the 1,500 educator preparation institutions in this country, and when I say sacrificial lambs, I think we're going to have to close some down. We're not going to be able to get the wolves away from our doors. I think the reality is, and I know, and I can speak about the state of Michigan, we have some teacher preparation programs that are bad and probably should be shut down. They're too small, they don't have the resources, they can't have good practical and internship experiences, and they probably should be shut down. And until we shut some of these programs down around the country, we're going to continue to be criticized and have people trying to reform traditional teacher preparation. With that, I am just about at the end of my 45 minutes. So as I promised, here's my website at Michigan State. When I get back, I will post the slides there. And let me thank you very much for your attention and your time, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.